At the recent funeral service for civil rights leader John Lewis, former President Barack Obama said this: "America was built by people like him. America was built by the John Lewises. He, as much as anyone in our history, brought this country a little closer to our highest ideals. And someday, when we do finish that long journey toward freedom, when we do form a more perfect union, whether it's years from now or decades, or even if it takes another 2 centuries, John Lewis will be a founding father of that fuller, fairer, better America." I'm thinking today of the founding mothers, the women who put their bodies on the line for full citizenship, for that fairer, better America. I'm thinking of the iron-jawed angels, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, of writer and activist Ida B. Wells Barnett, and organizer Mary Church Terrell, of Unitarian Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and of Fannie Lou Hamer, who worked for full citizenship in Mississippi in the 1960s. If you know anything about the suffrage movement, you have likely heard of Alice Paul, the single-minded young woman from New Jersey, raised in the tradition of Quaker activism, who brought a passion for women's suffrage and the tactics of civil disobedience home to the U.S., following her time in England, where she was active in the British suffrage movement. And by the way, we say suffragist rather than suffragette. The jet was a pejorative term, and the suffragists later claimed it sort of lightly as their own, but we say suffragist today. It was Paul, along with Lucy Burns and many other women, who marched in parades, picketed Woodrow Wilson's White House, and were jailed and force-fed in defiance of their hunger strikes, all creating press reports that showed to the nation the brutality by which the status quo would be protected. Here at First Unitarian Society, we are rightly proud of the women of this congregation who were actively involved in the movement to get Minnesota to ratify the 19th Amendment. Clara Hampson Euland, Alice Ames Winter, and others. You may also know that it took 72 years from the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton presented the Declaration on the Rights and Sentiments of Women, calling for the right of women to vote. 72 years from that convention to the passage of the 19th. Only one woman, Charlotte Woodward Pierce, was both present at Seneca Falls and lived to see the passage of the 19th. But unfortunately, her ill health kept her from exercising her right to vote before she died. I try to remember that 72-year span when I think the wheels of justice move too slowly, and then I remember that actually it took 117 years, 117 years for all the people in this democracy to achieve the vote via the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Here is what Carol Anderson of the Jackson, Mississippi League of Women Voters wrote earlier this year. After the 1869 meeting of the American Equal Rights Association, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and even Frederick Douglass deemed Black women's claims for voting freedom less urgent than those of white women and Black men, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper asserted, "We are all bound up in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse of its own soul." She demanded Black women be included as part of one great privileged nation. Anderson continues, "The 19th Amendment indeed finally gave women the right to vote, but we well understand, especially here in Mississippi, that Black women and men continued to battle for their legal privilege to cast ballots. A portion of that ultimate victory, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, is also owed to Black lionesses like Ella Baker, Daisy Bates, Fannie Lou Hamer, Dorothy Height, Diane Nash, Septima Poinsett Clark, Rosa Parks, and others. Much of this history comes to life in the new book, Vanguard, by historian and legal scholar Martha Jones. She offers a new history of African American women's political lives in America, recounting how they defied both racism and sexism to fight for the ballot, and how they wielded political power to secure equality and dignity of all persons. These original feminists and anti-racists were women who, from the earliest days of the Republic, were at the vanguard of women's rights, calling America to realize its best ideals. And the fight goes on. You may know that the heart of the 1965 Voting Rights Act was gutted by the 2013 Supreme Court decision. And since that time, marginalized communities, including Native Americans, African Americans, Latinx Americans, Asian Americans, and others in various states, have had to overcome obstacles that most white voters do not. One of the most important ways we can help secure the franchise for all people is to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act into law. The Lewis Act creates a new formula that applies to all states and hinges on rooting out repeated voter suppression over a rolling 25-year period. If the work of democracy is never done, this is the next part of our work to do, to pass this law to ensure voting rights for all Americans. Our democracy is under grave threat from many sides, from authoritarianism, from money in politics, and especially from the efforts to suppress the vote. Currently, the existential threat to the United States Postal Service by the current administration constitutes the direst menace to voting rights. Some of us are also rightly worried about the coming wave of evictions and how this might affect people who may be newly homeless and affect their ability to vote. The good news here, if we can find good news, is that in all 50 states, one does not need a physical address to cast a ballot. The National Coalition of the Homeless has the "You Don't Need a Home to Vote" campaign to educate people experiencing housing insecurity about their voting rights. What must be considered, of course, is that while voting is a basic function of citizenship, people who are enduring the trauma of living without secure housing may not have the immediate capacity to exercise their right to vote. Another area of voter rights that needs our attention is the return of the franchise to felons who have completed their sentences. A consequence of mass incarceration, and this is no accident, is that over 6 million Americans, including 1 in 13 African Americans, cannot vote because of a felony conviction. This is not right. As Unitarian Universalists, we think the democratic process is so important that we include it in the 7 principles by which we are guided. We covenant to affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of democratic process in our congregations and in society at large. This is not just political for us. It is bedrock to who we are as humanists and as human beings, that because each person has worth and dignity, that each of us has the right to make our voices heard. When Alice Paul was imprisoned and on hunger strike, she was taken to the psychiatric ward. The male doctor there asked Paul to explain her cause to him. as played by Hilary Swank in the film Iron-Jawed Angels. She hesitates and then says, "Look into your own heart. I swear to you, mine is no different. You want a place in the trades and professions where you can earn your bread. So do I. You want some means of self-expression, some way of satisfying your own personal ambitions. So do I. You want a voice in the government under which you live. So do I. What is there to explain?" The story of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution 100 years ago this week is a wonderful and complicated tale of tenacity, of young activists who have a different idea from the old guard of how to make change, of the kind of conviction that risks lives and health for greater good, of a single-minded focus on one issue that left out those who are most marginalized, of partial success masquerading as the whole thing, of rights enshrined but not ensured. As we continue to protect and defend this fragile democracy, let us do so in such a way that no one is ever left out again.